Hello and welcome to this session of NACW, where we'll be talking about the current state of play with low carbon fuel standards and our future directions. I'm very glad that you could join us today and very thankful and grateful for the Climate Action Reserve putting this forum together for us to discuss, and hope it'll be of good use for all of us. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to encourage you to get your questions in early. We'd like this to be a discussion. We want it to be tailored to your needs and what you want to get out of this session. And so as we spend this hour together, encourage you to get those questions in early so that we can answer them along the way and to the fullest extent possible. So thanks again for joining. My name is Brad Neff. I am with Radicle. I lead the biofuels work with Radicle, and we do carbon intensity modeling and opening up pathways into California's low carbon fuel standard, as well as BC's low carbon fuel standard, and other general work for clients. And so I'm pleased to be able to introduce you to our panel today. I'll start with Paola Mellow. She's the Executive Director, Low Carbon Fuels Division, Environment and Climate Change Canada, in charge of developing the federal clean fuel standard regulation. Welcome, Paola. And as an icebreaker, can you tell us one thing that you do in your personal life to fight climate change?
Sure, Brad. Great to be here. I guess the biggest thing I do these days would be the working from home. The whole federal government, the whole government of Canada is working from home right now, except for a very select number of positions in labs, for example. And I would say we're making a very significant contribution to reducing Canada's carbon footprint.
Yes, great. Thank you. As we all are joining here virtually. It's a little awkward, a little different, but what a great solution to not flying all over the planet to talk about how we can reduce emissions. So thanks for being here. Next, I'll introduce Cheryl Laskowski. She is the chief of the Transportation Fuels branch of the California Air Resources Board. She manages the low carbon fuel standard, which requires a reduction in the carbon intensity of California's transportation fuels by 20% in 2030, and is part of the state's climate portfolio strategy. Welcome, Cheryl. And can you share with us as an icebreaker who your climate hero is and why?
Sure. Hi, glad to be here and happy Earth Day. So yeah, my climate hero is actually a climate power couple that I really respect, that I first encountered in the late 1990s. And that is Terry Root and Stephen Schneider. They are both professors that worked on climate change issues. And Stephen Schneider in particular really pushed the climate change conversation beyond academia and put himself out for much pushback in the public sector, but really, proved that we needed to have that conversation go beyond just the ivory tower. And so it really resonated with me that we need solid research and it has to be communicated well to policymakers and the public.
Great. Yes, thank you. What a good reminder. And finally, Josh Bledsoe. He's counsel at Latham and Watkins Environment, Land and Resource Department. His practice focuses on complex infrastructure and development projects, particularly those utilizing renewables, low carbon, and carbon negative technologies. Josh has deep experience with climate change law and associated regulations such as low carbon fuel standard programs, cap and trade programs, and the federal renewable fuel standard program. He enjoy guiding clients to monetize the environmental attributes of their products or services. Welcome, Josh. As an icebreaker, can you share with the group one of the most impactful books you've read on climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Happy to do it. And thanks again to the Climate Action Reserve for hosting the conference. Delighted that we were able to do it this year virtually. And Brad, as a point of order on technology, I've lost you on video. That may just be me, that I can't see you anymore. But to answer the question, not a book, but it was actually a magazine. You probably remember from the National Geographic magazines, they always have those great inserts you can fold up and have the big mast. Well, about 15 years ago, I was already starting to do climate work as a lawyer. big pullout, and it showed the fluctuation of CO2 temperature and sea level rise over time. And this went back into deep history. And you saw it just undulate up and down, right? And it shows you where the ice ages were. And then at the very far right was the extent of recorded human history, right? It shows the narrow climate band, during which humanity basically created civilization, and we have cities and we have infrastructure. And it really hit home for me how vulnerable and how delicate our situation is if we start having a grand experiment with the climate. We don't know where it's going to go. And then, of course, the very far right, it showed where our CO2 concentrations are, the hockey stick chart, right? Off the page, basically. And so oftentimes in my job, when colleagues would come by the office 15 years ago and say, "What is climate change? What are you doing?" I would say, "Look on the wall." I literally taped it on my wall so I could explain, because I got so many questions all the time. So that's cheating a bit, but it was really that National Geographic magazine article.
Well, we'll let that slide. Thank you, Josh. And I think there's a lot of information out there, and it reminds me of those tidbits of information that I picked up along the way that really resonate with me too, and make this a personal matter. So I'm going to keep things rolling, and then I'll log off and log back on. So hopefully you can see me again. Thanks for letting me know that my video's off. I'm not sure why it's doing that.
You're back on.
You're back.
Oh, I'm back on. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't have to log off. Okay. Maybe Cheryl did that to me. I don't know. So I've talked to the panelists. We've got two main ground rules that we'd like to lay out for the group today, and that is that you can ask any question. No questions are off the table, so please get your questions in, and we'd love to discuss them, some of them, because our second ground rule is that we can decline to answer any questions that we like. That it's okay to say, "I don't know," or "It hasn't been decided," or "I'm just not at liberty to say." And I would also like to lay out, I know we have a lot of experts here listening as well. And so as questions come in the Q&A, feel free to chime in on the chat with your answers. And so we can make this more of a lively conversation. We've also put together a poll. And so if you look on the poll section of your tool, we're trying to use all the aspects here, but there is a poll there. We invite you to participate in that poll and hope to discuss that towards the end of this panel. But to start us off, Paola has generously offered to run us through a quick PowerPoint presentation, kind of a 101 on the Canadian program that's being developed. And then we'll let Cheryl react and do kind of a what's the same and what's different between the two programs. So Paola, if you can share your screen.
So I am going to pull this up. Can you confirm that you can see that?
Looks like it's coming up. I can see it now.
Okay, so I'll go through this very quickly, but just to give a quick overview. So this is the federal Canadian proposed clean fuel standards, where we have draft regulations out right now. And so there we go. So the Clean Fuel Standard is one key part of Canada's current climate change plan, which is called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy. And it regulates liquid fuels used in Canada. So liquid fuels include things like gasoline, diesel, and oil. So it isn't just transportation fuels, it's broader than that. So there is oil used for heating, electricity generation, for example. Those are regulated as well. It was originally going to cover gaseous and solid fuels as well, but when we released the new climate change plan this past December, we proposed an increase in our carbon price, and so we scaled back the coverage of the proposed clean fuel standard. But with covering liquid fuels in Canada, we expect to get over 20 megatons of emission reductions by 2030. So it's a very significant part of our climate change plan. And we have designed it in such a way that we believe we complement our carbon price as well. So we have both a price and a clean fuel standard in place in Canada. Or the price is currently in place. There's a proposed increase in place, and then the clean fuel standard is at a proposed regulatory stage right now. So we do in Canada right now have a blending mandate in place that this clean fuel standard will replace. We also have a suite of provincial regulations in place. Some of them are blending mandates. Some of them, like in BC, are very similar to the California program. So we have a bit of a range. And Canada's federal program is modeled after California and BC. So I guess the two big things that for us at a federal level as we move from the renewable fuels regulation to the clean fuel standard, we're moving to a life cycle approach. And so that is, we're looking at emissions from extraction, processing, distribution, and use. And we're also moving to a carbon intensity approach. So as opposed to requiring a certain amount of blending in fuel, we're looking at the units of emission per unit of energy. So to start off, we have a regulatory obligation that covers primary fossil fuel suppliers. So the vast majority of the volume of regulated fuels is the regulated entities responsible for the vast majority of regulated fuels are refineries and a couple upgraders in Canada. Our target, as you can see in this chart, starts out in 2022 at a very small required carbon intensity reduction and increases over time until 2030, where it levels out in the regulations. And in order to provide a level playing field, we're only regulating fuels used in Canada, not exports. We are...
Paola?
Yep.
Sorry if I can interrupt. It looks
Yeah,
like you're not displaying in full screen mode.
Oh,
so we have a
okay.
comment that if you could do that, it would be easier to read.
I have to be honest that I don't know how. So unless somebody can tell me. I'm not sure how I would do that.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to tell you how.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep press F5.
F5.
All right, let me see what I can do. There, did that help?
No.
Okay, I'm just going to keep going. I'm almost done. So it's a credit.
And we will share these slides afterward, right?
Yes. So it's a credit-based system. So regulated parties start out in a debit position, and the way they come into compliance is by acquiring and retiring credits on an annual basis. And there's 3 ways that you can generate credits. So there's GHG reduction projects that reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels. So these are things like carbon capture and storage, renewable electricity at a refinery. Second way is to produce or import low carbon fuels. So these are things like ethanol and biodiesel. And the third way is advanced vehicle technology like electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Credits can be generated by regulated parties or voluntary parties, and they're traded in a market. We have some compliance flexibilities. So one example of these is a compliance fund mechanism. So for example, up to 10% of a regulated party's annual obligation can be paid out into this compliance fund at a price specified by the federal government. And our price for the first year starts out at $350 per credit. And that price is actually based off sort of what California has in place for their credits clearance mechanism, translated into Canadian dollars, indexed to inflation. And that's it. And we have some information here for folks who are interested. We have a lot of information available publicly on our website. And of course, we'll share this afterwards. That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So Cheryl, over to you. Now we know a little bit about the developing Canadian program. Can you give us a little compare and contrast with what we have here in California?
Yeah, just a brief comparison, I guess. One is, ours is just for California, so it's just a state program, and we don't have to deal with a lot of the other jurisdictions or that Paola has to deal with the provinces. So, but the main difference I see is that we are solely transportation fuels, and so we haven't really considered the non-transportation fuels in our system yet, or I'm not sure if we you would, but that's a big difference. We're similar in kind of that, how we're ratcheting down the target. So ours is, I think, about 1.25% per year from a 2010 baseline, and yours is, it looks like, a 1% from a 2016 baseline. We also likewise don't include exports. So it seems like there's a lot of similarities and just a couple of differences in the program.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we do have a question, and this is perfect timing. We were going to ask this anyways, but Cheryl, can you talk to us a little bit about the LCFS rulemaking? Will it be one or two, and what's to come?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just step back a little bit and talk about LCFS in the context of California climate policy. So LCFS, California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard, is one policy in California's suite of measures to achieve our statewide GHG reduction goals. And that suite of measures is evaluated as part of our scoping plan. And the next scoping plan is set to kick off in the coming weeks, and it's due in 2022. So the scoping plan overall is going to be looking at how the state meets its long-term GHG reduction goals, including carbon neutrality in 2045. So as part of the scoping plan process, CARB will model all of the portfolio of policies that we have at hand to meet the GHG reduction goals, and LCFS is an important part of that. So, transportation itself is just a major area that we need to focus on, and so LCFS is certainly going to be a key area in that. So what we'll do is, the scoping plan is going to do the main modeling effort for all of the policies and saying, where do we need to pull the levers and how hard? And then we'll take that modeling effort as our starting point for an LCFS update beyond 2030. So we'll use kind of that umbrella approach and look at where we need to get to per the scoping plan. If we can get further along than the scoping plan is recommending, what that means for the fuel mix today and where it will need to go. So there's still a couple options on the table for us as far as a next rulemaking or two rulemakings, and we come to a decision on that. But a major rulemaking is certainly in our future, and that will look at beyond 2030 targets. It really needs to follow what the scoping plan is doing for the longer term state goals, and the other areas for opportunity in the program that are big efforts. They will also be part of that larger conversation, because we'll be looking at how many, what the targets need to be, how quickly we can get there, what fuels are going to help us. So that's going to be a major effort that's going to take a year or so, and we'll take our cues from the scoping plan. But as I said, they're starting that effort soon, and so regardless if we do a quick minor rulemaking first and then do a major rulemaking, or just do a major rulemaking, we're going to get to that in the next few years for sure.
So it sounds like the sequencing is the scoping plan will go first. It'll take at least a year, and then whether it's a minor or major update to LCFS, that will come after that. Is that correct?
Certainly, a major update will happen after the scoping plan has their modeling efforts done. So, for example, in 2017, the last time the scoping plan was updated, that's when they set the 18% reduction target for LCFS. And then LCFS, we took that and we identified that we could push it to 20% by 2030. And when the scoping plan was adopted in 2017, we adopted our regulation in 2018. So we don't have to wait for the entire scoping plan process to be adopted and completed before we can start ours. We just need to know kind of where they're going and what role LCFS plays in it. So if we do a minor rulemaking, we don't have to wait for the scoping plan modeling effort to be done, but anything major, including extension beyond 2030, will follow the scoping plan.
Okay, and just one more question. So we knew this was going to be a big question coming into this, so tell me if I'm pushing too hard, but do you have a date or an expected date when you might have a decision as to whether you'll have a minor rulemaking before the scoping plan's done?
Yeah, I think I've been saying it for a while that I hope to know in the next couple months, but I really mean it this time that I'm pretty sure that now that we have more certainty on where the scoping plan is going and the timing of that. And we had a workshop in October and we got a lot of really great feedback, and we've been digging into that a bit in the past several months. So just kind of seeing where we need to go with the regulation, what people are wanting to be adjusted, and then, you know, what makes sense from a timing perspective and a resource allocation perspective. We've got to make a decision pretty quickly. So I think in the next several months, we should have an update on how we're moving forward.
Okay, great. Well, you didn't hear it here first, but you did hear it here. All right. Thank you. Well, we'll move on. I do see other questions, and it's great to see you, Robert Parkhurst. We will get to your question. That's on our list. But wanted to transition to Josh. And Josh, can you talk to us a bit about federally here in the U.S., compare and contrast with the state programs, with Canada's program, and of course today being a big day, Earth Day, and the climate summit in DC. Can you give us a rundown federally?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it, Brad. I mean, what it really comes down to is, and the RFS is quite different. The Federal Renewable Fuel Standard Program is quite different than the California program, at least what's being proposed in Canada on the federal side. And the primary difference is that the RFS program, it's not directly focused on the carbon intensity or carbon reductions, right? It's more focused on blending requirements. I think of it more of an energy security frankly, regulation, as well as a support for the agricultural sector. It has, I would say, ancillary benefits for the climate, but it's not. That was not the original intent, frankly, in my view. And what you'll see with the RFS is it's a much more of a political animal and less sort of technology-driven type regulatory program. It's a very interesting bedfellows are formed with the RFS program. You have certain folks in the Republican Party that support the program and folks that oppose it. And that kind of lines up with whether they're an oil state or an ag state. And then you kind of see the same thing on the Democrat side, although not as much of a disparity on the views, but it does still exist. And maybe what the audience should have the takeaway for the distinction is that the RFS does have broad categories of different types of fuels. And if you fall within one category or another, it is a measurement of your GHG reductions. But the level of detail that California, and it looks like the Canadians will go into, is much more refined. I mean, down to the fractions of the grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And the RFS is a much blunter tool if you think about it in terms of how it drives carbon reductions. And the last thing I'll say, actually, it's two other things. Pricing. The LCFS is a much more robust price support than the RFS is. All the RFS RIN prices have been shooting up recently. Still, the LCFS outstrips it. And then there's also more certainty with the LCFS, I would say, and it looks like it would be also for the Canadian program, where you can look out and see the emission reduction targets in the future. The RFS, on an annual basis, they're setting the renewable fuel volume obligations. So it's sort of, hey, what's it going to be this year? And people, read the tea leaves and see and have their ideas about what the mandates will be, and then they'll figure out the demand and supply and what the RINs may be worth. But it's much more, kind of as you go program as opposed to what we're seeing in Canada and California.
Great, thank you. And can you read any tea leaves for us where it's going in the future? There's been talk about a federal LCFS program that seems like layering on to RFS. I can't imagine the RFS transitioning to that, but maybe a lot of discussion today. What are your thoughts?
Good question. A really good question. I mean, so Mary Nichols, the former chairwoman of the Air Resources Board, looked for a while like she may be the next EPA administrator, and she had made public statements that she was supportive of a federal LCFS program. Obviously, Mary is not the administrator, but we've taken a look at this from a number of different fronts, and I think there's a few different options, right? You could have legislation that could potentially create a federal LCFS program. Given the divided Congress, that seems difficult. But there may be a pathway for an administrative action by EPA to, at least create some sort of federal LCFS program. And now, I mean, I guess to be determined, but EPA does have very broad authority to regulate transportation fuels. And so it'd be interesting to see if the Biden administration decides to, press the envelope there or not on that front. And today, Brad, you're right, huge day, Earth Day, happy Earth Day, everyone. But there's a lot of announcements coming out of the Biden administration. And if you're trying to read between the lines, literally, of what's come out on electrification and support for biofuels and other low carbon fuels, it's really interesting. And so I have no big takeaways from the announcements today. I think what the thing the market should look for is what the administration does on, one, the renewable volume obligations that they're going to have to announce, and then two, what they do on the so-called reset. EPA now, I won't go into the details, but EPA now has broader authority to set these standards than they have before. It's not unlimited, but they have broader authority. So I think we'll get a sense, Brad, of what's coming when EPA takes that sort of next step on the RFS.
Great, thank you. And one point to be clear here is that if your fuel qualifies for the RF, you get the RFS, the RIN credit for that fuel. And if it's sold in California and qualifies for the LCFS program and generates credits, it can generate credits there too. So they can be stacked on top of each other along with other programs. So Paula, back to you. Just wondering if there's anything else this discussion has brought up that you'd like to make clear about California's, or about Canada's program, sorry. And then, how that will link up with BC's program.
Right. So as with the California program and the US federal program, that's how the Canadian federal and the BC program interact. So it's that stacking. So we basically stack incentives. And I think, as Cheryl said, the main difference perhaps is that we cover liquid fuels as opposed to transportation. So there's about 20% of total regulated volume that's used in stationary applications. So it's not insignificant. So those are that's probably the biggest difference.
Great. And then we have a question, Robert's question was particularly to you, about field-based practices like no-till or fertilizer optimization application. Will those qualify for the program?
So like in California, we have a model that's used to determine the carbon intensity of fuels, and then the value that the lower carbon intensity fuels gets under the system is the difference between the baseline and the lower carbon intensity fuel. We're building our own federal model in Canada. So it's a very significant undertaking. The other thing I guess I could say is, there's a question of how the clean fuel standard interacts with offsets. So if we have a pricing system and then that has its analogous like offset system that couples with it, and then there's credits under there for perhaps some agricultural practices. So in the clean fuel standard, because we're really trying to push those technological step changes that are more expensive, we're pretty generous in terms of stacking. So if you get funding, for example, if you get federal funding for a big technological project, it can still earn credits under the clean fuel standard. If you get offsets, you can still potentially, there's still some way to get value to the clean fuel standard. So it's probably more the other programs in Canada that are going to have to be more particular about emission reduction ownership than the clean fuel standard, because again, we've designed the system to push that technological change that's the expensive projects.
And Cheryl, what about, maybe I can turn kind of the same question to you, as a couple of the workshops late last year dealt with this issue. Just wondering if there's any thinking that you can share with the group.
Yeah, so in the October workshop last year, we did hear about some of these ag practices that are of interest from several groups. And I think that, it's definitely an interesting concept to us, and one of those that we are looking at internally. There's a lot of things that we consider before we say, we're going to move forward on something. And, the the practices itself, how much evidence there is, how much certainty around any kind of ag practice, what kind of benefit that gives, what's the longevity of that, what's the permanence of that, how are we going to monitor and verify that? There's a lot of components to that, and what is the ultimate benefit, and is LCFS incentivizing those benefits in the right way? And so those would all have to be considerations, and so that takes a lot of resources to just try to figure out. And where the science is right now, I'm not sure that I can say definitively if that makes sense for our program right now. Obviously, California and I'm sure Canada and others are supportive of positive ag practices that sequester carbon and make our land more productive so we don't have to use more land. So, those are all good things, just kind of the certainty around how that would work and certainty around what kind of benefits that's providing, and if LCFS is the right mechanism for that, still to be determined.
Yeah, well, thank you. As you mentioned, not using more land, I was reminded the other day that PCM doesn't have a indirect land use change value like the California, the GREET model does. And just interesting how that is definitely very important, but may not be the only factor in how much emissions are attributed to that crop that's grown on that land. So appreciate you taking on those very tricky questions. That's one of the things that draws me to this whole debate, is that it is very complex. It is difficult. There are no easy answers, but there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of solutions that we can put in place. So I wanted to open this up to all of you about, we talk about a lot about linkage in cap and trade programs and carbon pricing economy-wide, and wanted to open up the discussion. What would it take to link these different LCFS programs, and what would be the value of that, the pros and cons?
Yeah, I can start on kind of the concept of how linkage might work. So again, just to take a step back, we in California actively talk to other jurisdictions who either are implementing a clean fuel standard or are contemplating it. We really want others to learn from our experience and want to kind of lower that steep learning curve of how to start and implement a program. And so we're definitely interested in talking to jurisdictions, whether it's a linkage conversation or just a general conversation on how they would develop a program, and we have those conversations. And there is a lot of overlap with some of the jurisdictions that already have a program, especially Oregon, and we absolutely are open to working with governments to collaborate on however we can reduce emissions and getting away from fossil fuel combustion. If we wanted to specifically link, we don't have specific provisions right now saying how that would work, but there are some principles by which we would operate. And so we would want to ensure that the stringency of our standard and our program remains high. And we would not want linkage to somehow undermine the incentives for the clean fuels program. So, who's generating the credit? What are the credit generation opportunities? Are the credits fungible completely across the different programs? Would it be a one-way linkage or a two-way linkage? So there's a lot of complexities to that, which can be opportunities as well in terms of creating more certainty, making verification easier. There's just, there's certainly benefits of it. There's just a lot of considerations. As Paola mentioned, they're creating their own life cycle analysis model. We have our own. And so, those are important considerations in how we would look at linkage.
Now, Paola, from the Canadian side, what would it take to link?
So, I mean, I agree with everything Cheryl said. I guess the most difficult part would be the fungible units. So the units can be made through the life cycle analysis model. As Cheryl was saying, California has one, Canada has another one. How comparable are those two? Anybody who's worked with these models understands that they're incredibly complex. So that's a significant issue. I think the other issue for us, we have a very big, no surprise, we have a very big oil and gas sector. So we actually expect a lot of credits under that first compliance category, which is the things like carbon capture and storage, co-processing, renewable electricity at oil and gas plants. So those credits are being created under what we call quantification methods, and they dictate a certain way to calculate and measure, what is worth one credit. And so I think to respect that environmental integrity, those units all need to be fungible. And I think that's probably the big challenge. And then if you could get past that, it's just clear ownership around the emission reductions, right? So, I mean, in a perfect world, all these things would be linked. It's the complexity that's I think it's going to take us a while.
Yeah, a lot to work through there, and more jurisdictions coming online, right? Washington's hopefully getting closer to putting in place a program. So, Josh, from a third-party view, what do you think about linkage, and what do you think about Washington specifically?
Yeah, I mean, linkage, to underscore what Paola and Cheryl said, I mean, I can't say any better than they did. The complexity is really there. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than even linking cap and trade programs. And we've seen historically how hard that's been. And also you got to think about legal risk. I mean, today was a big day. The Biden administration announced that the DOJ is dropping the challenge to the linkage between the cap and trade program in California and Quebec. So, if you had a linkage of other types of programs, low carbon fuel programs, that's something that the lawyers will be working very hard on to think about whether it's a legal linkage or not, and thinking, is that durable as you flip from administration to administration potentially, right? And that's on the state, provincial, and federal levels in both countries, I would guess. I think it makes a lot of sense for linkage. I mean, Brad, you and I have talked about this for years in terms of, finding the lowest marginal cost of abatement for GHGs. So linkage makes a ton of sense. And so what that does is it maybe brings down the cost of compliance. But what it also does is it maybe allows the jurisdiction to have more climate ambition, which I think would, right? So if you're worried about the reduced incentive for low carbon fuel producers if the program's link, well, make the program more stringent, and then the pricing should catch back up, right? So there's ways to sort of modulate that issue. You bring up Washington. I know folks that environmental reporters, they are, I'm sure, closely attuned to this. The last I heard, and this is probably a few days old now, was that there needs to be a reconciliation between the two legislative houses in Washington. There's sort of two different versions of the LCFS, and they need to have a reconciliation process. And I will be, frank, I'm not sure what the latest status is today, but I think the legislative session is going to end fairly soon. And if they don't get it done, I understand that the bill dies, or both bills die. So I think we'll all be watching whatever it is, 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. On the 25th, the session ends, and while bills have passed both the House and the Senate, if they don't reconcile those bills, then it's all for naught, and we'll go for a fourth try next year. So I want to remind folks about the poll. We're trying the poll, and we would really appreciate your participation in that poll and get some feedback from you on those questions that we've come up with. But right now, I'll turn it over to Josh. And Josh, one of the issues that we wanted to address was investment certainty, and we kind of get at that with linkage because there's so much complexity. If you're on the fuel provider side and you're trying to get the best net back for your fuel, where do you sell it? Is a big question, and with all these different rules and different CIs and different jurisdictions, it makes it complicated. But can you help us just talk to us a bit about investment certainty and pricing risk? Yeah,
I mean, Brad, the question weekly basis from clients, as they're looking at whether to invest in the LCFS. Get questions: what is the LCFS? What does it stand for? Right? We're hearing about this $200 a ton carbon price. What is that? And so, but the truth of the matter is, there are, we're serious concerns, especially before the program was extended. So there was a 2018 rulemaking where CARB extended the program out to 2030. Not to say the program would have sunset in 2020. It would. I think the better terminology is plateau. And Cheryl will correct me on this, I'm sure. But that I like that sort of plateau term. But what happens? We had a lot of litigation, both state and federal litigation, challenging the LCFS program. The program was going to plateau in 2020, and so folks were frankly nervous. Capital providers were nervous about investing in facilities and in technology of the type that Paola was talking about. And those are substantial investments, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, depending on how big the facilities are, especially for CCUS projects. And now it's a different conversation. I will say anecdotally, only what I see come across my desk, my screen, there's a lot of interest from capital providers to want to get into these, sort of directly or indirectly. And the most important things they ask about are price risk. And then they also ask about change in law risk, which is, what if the legislature decides they don't like the LCFS? What if CARB decides to tweak the program? So these are the questions that we get a lot. And I'm not here to obviously lobby anyone in terms of how they design their program, but I can say that if there was more, program certainty, maybe a longer runway, and then maybe some price support, sort of guaranteed price support for the credit, I would anticipate even more capital flowing into the low carbon fuels market.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. So we were going to turn now to the poll, but I can't see the results, and I don't know if Anita, you can help us see the results or if there are any results. But while we're waiting, we've got a couple other questions. So Anita, if you can help us with that poll. So a couple other questions for California, for the California program. Do you allow obligated parties to pass on an obligated volume downstream or to another registered party? And if so, what's the rationale? Cheryl, can you take that for us?
Sure, I will try to. So deficits cannot be traded among entities after separating the fuel volumes like the credits can. So we don't want people shifting their obligation to other entities. But deficits can be transferred attached to the fuel volumes downstream, but not passed beyond the rack. So one of the reasons for that was to ensure that not just the producers or importers end up accumulating all the compliance obligation. And so there was more flexibility to work with business partners and find the best way to be in compliance. So it just provided some flexibility for compliance in the program.
Okay, great, thank you. And there is one other question, you may see it there, about the timeline for the scoping plan and the rulemaking. The earliest date ARB could set a post-2030 CI target.
Yeah, so like I said, the scoping plan is kicking off in probably the coming weeks or months, and they are required to adopt a scoping plan every 5 years. So that means 2022 is the next date for a scoping plan. And as I mentioned, the last time a scoping plan was updated, it was in mid to late 2017, I think. And then in 2018 is when LCFS got updated. So I would think that the earliest we could go is probably, if the scoping plan gets updated in 2022, maybe late 2023 for, or 2024. So that's kind of the earliest that I would see. So maybe an implementation date of 2024 or 2025. And that's all predicated on whether we do 1 or 2 as well. So if we do 2, the date gets pushed, obviously, for the major rulemaking. But yeah, we're probably a couple years away from the post-2030.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe one for you and Paola. Are there feedstocks that currently aren't part of the LCFS program that you think you'll consider in the future? And do you look at the ISCC's work in this area?
We consider, if someone has an application for a pathway, we will look at it. We want to be assured that there's some certainty in that product being delivered to us, because as you can imagine, evaluating the life cycle impacts of that, and just, doing all of our due diligence on any new feedstock, especially, if it's a new one to us, because there's always new ones that are out there, that we're doing, our research, and that takes resources. And so we want to make sure that we're using our time in the best way, and we're, evaluating current applications, we're doing verification, we're implementing the program, and we're trying to figure out where the next opportunities are coming from. So we definitely want people to be looking at those opportunities and bringing new things to market that really are advancing the technology and getting us to lower carbon fuels, but we want to do it with some due diligence. So it's really a case-by-case basis on what that looks like and the certainty around that fuel being delivered.
And do you leverage things like ISCC?
We look at what other markets are doing and what other research is out there. We always have to do our own analysis because we do use our own models, and we want to be consistently evaluating based on our regulations. So we look at those, but really we take cues from applicants and where they are in the process, how likely those things are going to come to market, and then we do research and see what the other markets are. If things have been successful in other markets and certified in other markets, that obviously, we look at that.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Paula, I cut you off.
I was just going to say, same thing with the Canadian program. We have we'll have the capacity for new applications for new processes to move through the model, and also for our other that other compliance category that I talked about before, for those large project-based emissions, that will also have sort of an evergreen process where people can apply with new projects to try to put in place a new quantification methodology. So it's a very, I would say, unique challenge with this program is to build a system that's evergreen, because you want things to be continually evolving. You want to incent ongoing technological advancement, but that means that you're always sort of working at it. So I find it's a unique challenge to this type of regulation.
Yeah, and we find as we work with clients that it is a push-pull. You get those innovative projects, great ideas, and you've got to work with the regulator, and these things are pretty malleable, right? You can use those tools and come up with a CI score, and it's just a matter of putting in that rigor and getting that approval and making sure that it fits within the program. So appreciate that. Josh, maybe a couple here for you, not to leave you out, because when do you think the EPA will announce 2021-2022 RVO? Any idea?
Oh, I wish I knew. But what I have heard, and it's probably what others have heard, is that they may announce multiple years at once to give, maybe address the issue that I flagged earlier, which is a little bit more certainty for the market about what the demand for fuels would be. So that I can't say when, but it does seem somewhat likely it'll be more than 1 year being announced, perhaps a couple years at the same time.
Great. And then another one specific to you. And is LCFS enough to promote carbon capture technologies? And I find that interesting at $200 a ton. Is that enough, or is more needed for carbon capture?
Listen, it's a really good question. And one thing you mentioned stacking before, Brad. So one thing we do have in the U.S. is we have the 45Q tax credits, and those go from $35 to $50 a ton, and it depends on the type of carbon capture you're doing, either enhanced oil recovery or not. But you can stack those with the LCFS credits. And so, what we're seeing in the market, what we're seeing on some of our projects is that that price support may be enough between the combination of the two. But let's remember, the LCFS is for as broad and complex as it is still somewhat narrow, right? You have to have that nexus. There's one notable exception. You have to have a nexus to the California transportation fuel market. And so it's not all CCS projects can get that credit. There's only certain subset can get the credit. So for example, if you had a natural gas fired power plant in California and you have a new technology to capture the emissions and permanently sequester it underground, you don't get LCFS credits for that, right? Unless there's some other aspect of the project tied in the transportation market, because the cap and trade program regulations do not yet allow you. The architecture is there, I should say, but they don't yet allow you to do this, use the CCS protocol to get credit. So I think the answer to the question is no, for broadly for CCS, but for those projects that can access the transportation fuel market in California, the answer so far appears to be yes.
Yeah, great point. And is anybody here familiar with the Renuva Bio in Brazil? And does it promote biofuels? I think broadly the answer is yes, as much as I know about it. But I don't think we have an expert on this panel to talk to that. So maybe we can go to the poll, even though I can't see the results. I think there's some interesting things here that we can discuss for just a minute. And that is, oh, Anita's coming online.
Hi, Brad. Yes, can you please click the left bottom button? It gives you the results.
I keep clicking that show results and it doesn't show results.
Okay, let's see here. I would put it on the chat. Oh, that doesn't work.
So maybe you can share that with us afterward.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about technology neutral, and I know there's a lot of talk in California and probably in Canada as well that these programs should be technology neutral to make them most cost effective and be a level playing field. But there is a role for technology forcing as well, right? There's a role for those things that are very expensive right now that can have big impacts down the road, not to wait for those late. So Josh, maybe you can kick us off here. I know in our pre-work, you brought up the issue of the capacity credits in California, and Cheryl, maybe you can respond to that.
Yeah, I suspect the audience will hear from Cheryl and Paola on this one, but I guess I'll tee it up. So I think the LCFS program is largely a technology neutral program. I mean, you shave off carbon where you can, and you're eligible for credits. I think that's generally how it works. There are a couple of exceptions where there's a capacity crediting program both for hydrogen refueling and for fast EV charging. And instead of looking at the fuel volumes delivered, whatever metric that is, kilowatt hours or gallons of equivalent, instead it's what is the capacity of that refueling infrastructure, and you get a stream of credits that will be issued to you over time, just for building it, right? I'll probably get in trouble with some Hollywood studio if I say if you build it, they will come. But I think that's sort of the idea with the capacity crediting program. And the reason it's relevant here is that that's only for hydrogen and electricity. It's not available to other low carbon fuels, potentially even carbon negative fuels. And so that was what I would say one of the few sort of steer away from the technology neutral aspects of the LCFS.
Yeah, well explained, Joshua. Thank you. So yeah, those provisions were at the direction of our board, and they are very narrow credit generators. So they are only able to generate 2.5% of the credits, according to what the previous quarter was, not to get too in the weeds, but we're at about 1% right now. So we're not at that limit. And so it's a very small piece of the credit market. And that was intentional because of what Josh said. It's there's a chicken and egg problem that everyone knows about with this technology. And so, where that makes sense, then, I think that we have that flexibility in the regulation to do that. The policy really is to incentivize low carbon fuels, and the CI score is the signal that is sent on where we want to see the fuels. We want to see the lowest possible CI score, or have opportunities to even take GHGs out that would otherwise be emitted, or even the sequestration aspect. So yeah, but I would just kind of also say the lens through which I look at LCFS isn't about, it's more about the broader policy that we're trying to achieve, and how do we achieve that policy. So carbon neutrality, we also have a ZEV-EO executive order that we're going to have to get to. We have some policies that we're going to have to look at with LCFS and do some evaluation on how are we going to get there, and what are those incentives needed, and where do we need to push, and where are current fuels best suited. We're certainly in liquid fuels for a while. We're not just going to wake up tomorrow and say, no one's going to use any more liquid fuels. But I think that, we need to be focused more on the policy and how we're going to achieve those overall GHG reduction goals. And there's a lot of forces at play for that. So, but yes, we're generally rewarding those who are producing low CI fuels, and we have incentivized this narrow sliver for the capacity credits.
Yeah, I would say that in Canada, we've tried very hard to be technology neutral. Again, because we do have that big oil and gas sector, I think there's a lot more of that compliance category 1 credits under the Canadian system than you would see under the California system. And, our critics would say, that there is differences in how those two groups of credits are created. And there is, because one's created through a model and the other one's created through quantification methodologies. And as hard as you try, the fact that they're created through different processes means that there's differences. So, we do certainly get feedback that, one approach is advantageous in this way, the other approach is advantageous in that way. But at the end of the day, we do try very hard to be technology neutral. And I guess the way we look at it is, the challenge is so big and the ambition is such that you're going to need everything. Electrification, lower carbon fuels, like lower carbon liquid fuels, like there's no, in a sense, all the solutions are going to need to be brought to bear. So we think there's plenty of scope for all technologies that prove to be successful.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Heather, for providing me with the results of that survey question, or that poll question. 78%, you can probably all see this, and I'm the one who can't see it, but 78% in favor of technology neutral and 22% in favor of technology forcing. Justin Johnson, also great to see you here joining in. When does LCFS move east in a meaningful way? Well, we should ask you that question, I think. Thank you for your work in the east, and let's keep that moving. I would just like to ask each of the panelists their one key takeaway, and then we'll close this out, but hopefully keep the discussion going throughout the conference and throughout our work together. So thank you very much for your engagement. And so each panelist, just take 5 seconds. What's your key takeaway from this panel discussion?
I could go first. So I guess I would say, from my perspective, one key thing you mentioned earlier was the certainty for investors, and I think that like Cheryl's program in California, the federal program in Canada, we have like a level trajectory after 2030, and so I think there's the question of post 2030 ambition, and because, as Josh was saying, these these investments are so significant a lot of times. Like the level of ambition in the Canadian program, would require, new biofuel production builds to generate the type of fuel volumes we need, be they Canada, the US, or wherever. So these are really big investments we're talking about. And so, what's the level of certainty? What's the required stacking of programs to get those investments going? And I think that's a big challenge for all of us.
Great, thank you. It all comes back to economics and market dynamics. Okay, Cheryl.
Yeah, I think just the level of interest and the detailed questions that we're getting show, how much people are invested in and care about this program and see it as a value and an opportunity. And I would throw that back at all of the folks listening as, there's a lot of smart people, there's a lot of brains in a lot of different sectors. And so we look also to you for those innovations and opportunities. We need those step changes. We need the investments in the right place. We need to hear from you of where those opportunities are and investments are best served. So I think that that's really great to hear from people. So love the detailed questions. Thanks.
Round us out, Josh.
So what I would say is there's a lot of money looking for a home on the ESG investing side. And I know that Cheryl and Paola and every other regulator in different jurisdictions, they're constrained by the amount of authority they have. But I would say, to the extent that you can provide more investment certainty, it'll go a long ways to bringing that capital into the programs. It just feels like we're on the crest here, and the wave's about to come into shore with a lot of capital in the low carbon fuel sector. So the extent that anything can be done on investment certainty, I think it would really move the programs along and potentially even give the regulators the line of sight to have even more ambition for the programs.
Great, thank you. As we see that wave going eastward, we see a number of states talking about LCFS programs and putting them in. And I see this kind of as an RPS, it's spreading around the nation, just like RPSs did. But my key takeaway is how complex this will be with the level of complexity in these markets if we don't find some way to organize and synthesize those programs. So we will leave it there, and hopefully this is the beginning of a longer conversation. We look forward to engaging in it with all. Thank you very much for joining. Have a great day. Bye-bye.